Preach the word. I love that charge. But is it always an easy thing to do? Is it always a simple and easy task to complete, to preach the word? In other words, what do you do in the face of opposition? In life, you have two choices when opposition comes your way. You can either eventually give up and start something else, or you can keep going and fight through and push through until you overcome that opposition. I want to give you guys a famous quote from probably the most famous boxer of all time, Rocky Balboa. This is what he says. He says, I'm going to tell you something you already know. The world ain't all sunshine and rainbows. It's a very mean and nasty place, and it doesn't matter how tough you are, it'll beat you to your knees and keep you there if you let it. You, me, or nobody is going to hit as hard as life. But it ain't about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward, how much you can take and keep moving forward. That's how winning is done. I think Amos understood this, not that it was Rocky, but I think he understood the principle. And I want to invite your attention to the book of Amos. And Amos has a difficult task ahead of him. You have a guy from the south, from the deep south. Maybe some of us can relate more than others that he's a southern boy. He goes up to the north to preach, so already he's facing a little bit of opposition there because they don't really want him there. In chapter 2, verse 12, though, we see what Amos prophesies to him from what God says to the Israelites. He says, "But you made the Nazarites drink wine and commanded the prophets, you shall not prophesy." Yet here Amos is, in a place that he's not from, doing the thing that they don't want done. But it's because God said that you have to do this. They need this. You need to go do this for my people. So he does. A lot of what the Israelites are doing during this time are wicked, wicked things. Among them are oppressing the poor, taking advantage of the little people. They are in all sorts of different idolatry, things of that nature, as they always tend to be for some reason. And so that's why they have just cut these prophets off. They didn't want to hear the things that they weren't supposed to do. They didn't want to hear the things that they were supposed to do. What they did, they forced them to be silent so that they could sin without hearing and without seeing God. They just said, no more. We don't want any more of this. But Amos is still here in the heart of where this is going on, preaching, prophesying for God. And he tells them in chapter 3, verse 2, this is what God says to them. "You only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you for all of your iniquities." There's a thought behind this verse in chapter 3, verse 2, that to whom much is given, much is expected. In our study of Romans right now, we're going through, and it comes about that the Jews might be proposing a question of what benefit is there even being a Jew? And Paul has to tell them, in every way there's a benefit. You have the law. You were chosen as a nation by God. You have a benefit above everybody else because God chose you. And this is what is happening back here. But even though God chose them, they chose to go a different way. They weren't living up to the expectation that God had for them. They weren't living up to the ideals and dreams that God wanted them to be and do. And Amos is here to tell them that. And of course, as you can expect, when people are told a lot that what you're doing is wrong, you need to stop, all this that you're doing, you need to turn away and completely change your life, not everybody loves that, now do they? People don't like always hearing the truth, but the truth must be spoken. In chapter 7 of Amos, that opposition finally has a face. And it's in the form of a priest named Amaziah, however you want to say it. This guy's a priest. And he comes up to him, and this is what he says. He says, "O seer, flee to the land of Judah. Eat bread and prophesy there, but never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary, and it is the temple of the kingdom." We can pick out a few things that are wrong with what he tells Amos. First of all, that it's the king's sanctuary. It's not God's land, apparently. It's not God's place. But what he says in the very beginning of this, when he says, "Oh, seer, go flee to the land of Judah," this is a racial slur. And what he says when saying, "Oh, seer," seer is another word for prophet, by the way. When he says, "Oh, seer," it's as if he is calling him old school or old-fashioned. He's saying, we don't need any of that. We don't need what you're selling. We don't want it. He's doing the same thing that they did back before when they tried to silence the prophets. But Amos, look how Amos replies to this opposition in verse 14 of Amos chapter 7. Then Amos answered and said to Amaziah, "I was no prophet, nor a prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, 'Go prophesy to my people Israel. Now, therefore, hear the word of the Lord.'" Oh, I love that. I love that so much. Opposition, the thing about opposition, it's not always just people. And what I mean by that is opposition can be just the fear or the intimidation factor of the task that is at hand. It can be the fear within yourself, but a lot of the time, what the opposition is yourself or your old self. See, Amos said here in verse 14, "You're right, I was no prophet, nor was my dad, nor was my daddy's dad. I was a herdsman, I was a dresser of sycamore figs." And he could have left and said, "I'm going to go back to what I know. I'm going to go back to what I've done all my life. That way I don't have to deal with y'all being angry at me. You don't have to deal with me prophesying about God to you. So I'm just going to make it easy on both of us and go back." But that's not what Amos said. Amos said, "But the Lord has made me this, and this is what God has told me to do, so hear his word." Amos did a couple of things here. First of all, he remembered God. In the face of opposition and everything else in life, not just in those situations, the number one thing, remember God. Amos remembered who God is, that God is sovereign, that God is king, that God is ruler of everything, that God is in control in a place where he might not have felt like he had control. God was in control, and he knew that. He also recognized who the message was. When you look there in verse, in verse 15, or 16, when he says, "Hear the word of the Lord," he doesn't say, "Here's my thoughts on the subject," or "Here's what I think." No, he says, "Here's what God has to say." That's one side of the coin, if you will. The other side of that coin is he knew what the message was. See, you and I, we can recognize that this is God's word, right? We can recognize that all day long. But unless we know what the message in it is, it's not going to do much good, is it? So we have to know what the message is. And Amos took confidence. He was able to take boldness in the fact that he knew who God was, that God was in control, whose message it was, what he was to speak. And so he was able to speak. And the other thing that he's done overall, the last thing, Amos took ownership of what God had called him to be, what God had declared him to be now. See, you and I, we used to be one thing as Christians. Even before we came to school, when we were Christians, we had other professions. Some of us, our profession was mooching off of our parents, but at the same time, we can all go back to that. We can all go back to that at any time. But that is not what you are to do in opposition. You are to push through and keep going like Amos does. And he kept prophesying what God had said. You get to the end of Amos, 90% of his message is doom and gloom. There's that hope at the end, that hope for why they are to do this as well. In verse 11 of chapter 9, he says this, "In that day," so now we know it's messianic, "in that day, I will raise up the booth of David that has fallen and repair its breaches and raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the days of old." Verse 12 says, "That they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this." In Acts chapter 15, James explains this in verse 16 through 19. And essentially what he says is, when it says nations, he says Gentiles. He says everybody can be a part of this hope that came. That Jesus, when he came, he delivered this hope. He accomplished what he came here to do. The hope has been brought. The hope is here. The question remains, though, now that the hope has come, now that Jesus has come to do what he intended to do, is that it? Or is there more to it? Does that mean that the work is completed?
Does that mean that the work is done? Jesus didn't seem to think so. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. He came to fulfill the law and the prophets, but the work wasn't done. Jesus called the 12 apostles and his plus one, and then many more. In Luke chapter 5, Jesus calls his first disciples. He says, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men." And in Acts chapter 9, he calls Saul of Tarsus while he's on his way to Damascus with letters in hand to persecute the church. Jesus called men to himself. We're called today, no, not in the same way. We don't hear Jesus' voice. We're not driving down the road and we don't see a bright light and hear Jesus call us. We're not at work and we don't get a shoulder tap and say, "Hey, come and follow me." See, they had Jesus. They had his voice. But we have his word written down for us by the apostles. 2 Thessalonians 2:15. Jesus called men to himself. He called men to service. He called them from all different kinds of occupations. He called a tax collector. He called fishermen. He called a persecutor of his church. Now, many of us here, unlike Amos, are sons and daughters of preachers or of evangelists. Some of us aren't. I'm not. I'm just a construction worker. Some of us came from law enforcement. Some of us came from the paramedic or medical field, from mechanics, from all different walks of life. But we were all called in a sense that we're here to complete the mission that Jesus gave us to do. In Matthew 28 and in Mark 16, we're here to preach and we're here to teach God's truth. Paul said in 2 Timothy 4:5 to do the work of an evangelist. We can leave here. We can pump ourselves up and we can get all excited. We can grab knowledge and we can get excited and we can rustle ourselves up and we can leave these halls full of energy and joy, ready to go and to preach the word, to teach the gospel. But when we leave here, we're going to face opposition. When we leave here, we're going to run up against walls. We're going to run up against people who will stand in our way, or against people who don't want to hear what we have to say. They're not interested in a saving grace of Jesus. The apostles ran up against opposition and persecution. Now, it was indirectly at first. In Mark 2, verse 23, the disciples and Jesus are walking through a field and they're picking the husks. And the Pharisees accused them of breaking the Sabbath. It started off easy. But then after the cross, after Pentecost, those apostles got arrested, became beat. Acts 3, 5, 6, and 12 all tell their stories. In Acts chapter 7, we learn of the stoning of Stephen. In Acts chapter 8, the persecution breaks out, started by Saul, later to be known as Paul. But they endured persecution. They endured opposition. Now, Paul, imagine for a moment, Paul, Pharisee of Pharisees, Hebrews of Hebrews, persecutor of the church. When he had his come to Jesus meeting, what do you think his friends thought? What do you think those men who were side by side with him, kicking down doors and dragging brothers and sisters of the church, locking them up, some of them put to death? Do you think that Paul received opposition from them? Now, when we leave here, and some of you may have already experienced this, Some of the most opposition or the strongest opposition you may face is from your own family, from your own friends, from your co-workers. I used to manage a construction company. And every time I would talk about God or I would bring up Jesus or something like that, I got persecuted. Almost to the point where I thought maybe I just shouldn't even bring it up. But I chose to quit that job managing a construction company because I wanted to speak truth for God. I gave up that life, I gave up that income, I gave up all of that because I wanted to find a way to serve God. Now, Paul also saw persecution after he first converted in chapter 9 and verse 23, and he's in Damascus. They wanted to kill him. So he flees from there, he goes to Jerusalem. The church is opposed to him because they're afraid of him. We learn throughout Acts all of the persecution, all of the trials that Paul faces. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 27, Paul sums it all up. He says, "Are they servants of Christ? I speak as if insane, I more so, in far more labors, in far more imprisonments, beaten times without number, often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. I was shipwrecked. A night and day I spent in the deep. I have been on frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among false brethren. I have been in labor and hardship, through many sleepless nights in hunger and thirst, without food, in cold and exposure." Paul faced opposition. In Acts chapter 4, or Acts 14:19, I love the story of Paul. He's drug out of the city. He's stoned to the point of death or to death. Paul gets up. Imagine brushing himself off, maybe working some of those kinks out. What would you do? We might run. We might want to turn and go the other way. Paul got up and he went right back into that city. Stayed the night and then moved on and continued the work that he was doing. We're going to face opposition. We're going to face persecution. But what are we going to do in the face of that? Are we going to choose to turn, to go back to our old life? Are we going to go back to those jobs that we had before? You may have heard this a lot being here. If you can do anything else, go and do that. I heard that over and over through my first year. And at first I didn't really understand. I didn't grasp what it meant. I do now. If you can do anything else, go and do that. But we're here because we want to preach the Word of God. We want to, when we face that opposition, be strong and be strengthened in the Lord in order to carry ourselves through, to continue the work that God has given us to do. How are we going to respond? We saw how the apostles responded, but how do we respond? James, in chapter 1, verses 2 and following, says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." In 2 Timothy 4:5, we're to endure hardships. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 13, Paul writes, "Be on alert. Stand firm in the faith. Act like men. Be strong. 2 Timothy 2:2, we're to teach that pattern to others. And in verse 2 of chapter 2, we preach the word, no matter what comes our way. In Luke chapter 9, verse 23, Jesus says, "Pick up your cross and follow me daily." The prophets of old were called by God. The apostles were called by God. And in a sense, we're called by God through His Scripture. Now, they endured opposition and persecution for the calling, and some of them paid the ultimate price. In strife, they persevered steadfastly. We will face trials and hardships. Will we stand firm? Will you stand firm? Will you boldly speak the truth of the gospel? Are you willing to teach truth? To teach the truth to those who will hate you, who don't understand you, who don't like you? They took up their cross and they followed Jesus. Are you willing to take up your cross? Are you willing to take up your cross for those who will nail you to it?